Welcome to another Black History Month event. This event is the Poetry and Pieces workshop focusing on poetry and literature by Lisa Leung-Tat. As a quick disclaimer, views expressed by the speakers and workshop facilitators do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the organizing groups. Similarly, all programming uses the Zoom meeting or Zoom webinar format. The webinar format is to prevent unexpected interruptions. It's not that we don't want to hear you. In fact, it's quite the opposite. In those cases, questions for speakers can be submitted using the question and answer chat function. However, this is a Zoom meeting because it's a workshop, which means everyone can turn on their cameras and communicate as normal. As always, this programming is brought to you by the Black Literacy and Arts Collaborative Project. They're a Boston-based organization creating resources for literacy and arts for communities of color, which are historically underserved. They have mentorship programs, a storytelling project to build medical trust, this amazing Spread the Love program where they get strangers to write notes of companionship and encouragement for one another, and book giveaways. You can learn more about them at theblackproject.org. Similarly, this programming was conceptualized by the People's Heart. They're a healthcare institution and community art and placemaking collaboration. Their mission is to change institutional healthcare culture and empower underserved patients and communities of color through art and design. Programming includes art on walls, workshops, lectures like this, and pop-up health events. You can learn more about them at thepeoplesheart.org. Now, without further ado.
Okay, so this is the first piece of the poem. And so I'll just read it here and then, excuse me, we can talk a little bit about what resonated with folks, what themes do you see arising? I think, but first I'd like to talk a little bit about this idea of the hill we climb and what symbolism do we see in the hill? What things come up for you when you think about a hill? And if coming off, I'm going to stop share here for a second, if that's okay. If doing it in the chat is a little cumbersome, then absolutely maybe coming off mute to discuss what is the idea of a hill. What do you think of when you see a hill, or when you think of a hill? What do you think is the symbolism in that? Go ahead, Jessica.
So you should know I'm a photographer, so I visualize everything. So I think of being at the bottom of this hill where all the kids played, where I grew up, and it just seems so huge. And I think of the camera being right at that, where it just looks so huge. Just a really big challenge.
Right, right, thank you, yeah. So this idea of the hill, right, representing, as Jessica said, a challenge and something that we have to climb to get to the top. And the fact that, I don't know about you guys, but my perception is a hill is not something that's easy, right? If you're thinking about, you know, getting to the top, it typically is, it imbues work, right? You have to walk towards that. Sometimes I don't believe I know of anyone who, and of course, we're not thinking about a slope, we're thinking about a hill. So then the idea is it's something that you have to go up slowly and carefully, and you have to be intentional about each move, right? And so the idea about the hill we climb is, where are we going to and how are we getting there, right? And this perception that whatever we're doing to get to the top is not going to be easy, right? Okay, so let me go back to, I'm gonna go back to this piece, and now we'll dive a little bit into the first piece.
I have one other thought, sorry, about the hill.
Yeah.
I was thinking about Capitol Hill and
Absolutely.
Washington, D.C. and our nation, and kind of this poem is being a response to some of the interaction that happened at our Capitol, and
that hill, yeah,
like overcoming the challenges doing something difficult, as we just sort of described, but also the actual reference to a place, that Capitol Hill. I don't know if she means that or not.
Yeah, no, I thought of that as
reminded me of.
well. Yeah, I thought of that as well, right? Capitol Hill and the symbolism behind what the hill means in climbing, but also the literal in terms of this space, because this was, of course, after the insurrection, right? And we know that her completing the poem had a lot, you know, after the insurrection, she sort of was able to complete her piece, right? After thinking so much about how she would bring forth this piece at the inauguration.
I'm, along with the hill that we climb, I'm also drawn to the word we.
Very collective.
Yeah, we're climbing that hill, and it's which we, and all of us we, or
Yeah.
are hills different for different we's?
That's true. I get the sense that she is collectively saying we as the United States, right? But yeah, she immediately uses this collective term, bringing us all into the space of having the discussion about this hill that we're climbing. Yeah, for sure.
Can I also add, when I think about climbing a hill, a lot of it for me is the purpose of getting to the top and having the view. And there's something about this poem that is kind of hearkening to the view of our country's history and where we're going, and, you know, kind of that bird's eye view when you get to the top of a hill. You sort of, it's an achievement. You kind of relax and you look around and you get to see this beautiful view.
Right. And I wonder, I mean, again, this is all our interpretation of her piece, right? I wonder if it's this idea of when we get to the top, like you said, Cassandra, it's this overview that we have. But does that overview encompass everything that is the United States, right? Both this scenic view that we really wanted to get to, but also maybe way in the distance, the stuff that we were trying to get away from, right? So having this view that is all encompassing of everything that the United States stands for, right?
Yeah, I like that. Like that,
Yeah.
even the part of our history that we'd like to forget, you know,
Exactly.
and cover up. When you climb, you see it, you should see it all, you know.
Exactly. So having this view of everything, right? Okay, so the first verse I'm going to read, and then we can talk a little bit about that. So when day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We brave the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. Thoughts about that? What do we think is the never-ending shade? What is that reference to? Do we have any thoughts about that? Cassandra?
Well, to me, that's, in my mind, that's a reference to just the racism and the history of slavery in this country, and how people of color are still left behind, you know.
Yeah. Any themes in particular do we find that stands out? Because she opens up with shade, right? And so what themes do we think we can garner from this idea of, and she talks about it. She says, when day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? And so maybe we could think of a theme as light and dark, right? This idea that we're hoping to move towards the light, but there's so much dark in the past that we haven't yet addressed. The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. What things come up for you when you think of, I think a sea is a huge expanse, right? And we have to, she doesn't even say we swim, we're actually wading, which for me, I think is a slow movement, right? So the loss we carry, a sea we must wade, we braved the belly of the beast. What comes up for you in terms of what do you think about when you hear that term, the belly of the beast? Does that strike you as something that is easy? And if we were to reference this last couple of years, what can we reference as being the belly of the beast? Jessica.
Well, I'm right outside of DC, and for me, it's always DC and politics. Belly of the beast has that reference, and then it has some historical literature reference, which I'm blanking on right now, but that's what I always think of is people talk about, I'm in the belly of the beast because I'm right here in DC. So that's what, and it goes back to the hill being Capitol Hill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so DC where, when we think of politics and government, that's where we think of it as being housed. So then DC is what you're saying, Jessica, as representative of the beast, right? And so when you're existing in DC, you're in the belly of the beast, so to speak.
Yeah, but it's also when I think about like where she sits it in the poem, and it's aligned with the shade that it's the violence. It's a violent history that is so condoned by our governments, by our federal, state, and local government. So it's both a reference to government being the belly of the beast, and then the general amount of violence our history stands on.
Agreed. Yeah. Agreed. Any other thoughts?
I totally thought the belly of the beast was the Trump presidency.
All up interpretation. Andrea.
I was going to say, for me, the belly of the beast, it has a biblical reference for me. In the story of Jonah, who was basically God told him to go one way and he chose not to go that way. And I could be completely jacking up this story, so please, folks, read it for yourself. But he didn't go where God told him to go, and then he was swallowed up by a whale. So that sort of going in the wrong direction led to temporarily him being in a bad situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, when I hear belly of the beast, it's nothing good, right? It's definitely, it's not even that it's challenging. It's just like the worst place you can be, right? The worst kinds of experience. And to me, when I read that, I thought like it felt like being in the belly of the beast for the last 2 years. Experiencing COVID, having all these restrictions, really being not doing what we're accustomed to doing, and sort of seeing no light out of the end of the tunnel, right? So it felt as though we were in a very dark place during COVID. And when I read that, I thought, the belly of the beast could be so many things to so many people, and experiencing what can that be for you, right? And so here we hear different things as to what the belly of the beast could be. Meg.
For me, it was so soon after the insurrection that I'm thinking about the insurrection and, police brutality and violence against people of color. And the next line, we've learned that quiet isn't always peace.
Right.
It's calling for allyship. Like, you can't be quiet anymore.
Right. And I think even that piece where she talks about quiet, I interpret it to mean that quiet is sort of reflective of nothing happening. And so that's not okay. Quiet for me represents status quo, right? The things that are normal, the things that we just let happen because it was just there. And just having this version of, she said, we've learned that quiet isn't always peace. So the status quo doesn't always mean that we're in a peaceful space, and the norms and notions of what just is, meaning the status quo, isn't always justice. I love those two lines. I thought she did that wonderfully in explaining, what is and this other piece of justice and how that shows up. Andrea.
I was going to say, for these two lines, it also reminded me of this phrase, no justice, no peace. So it's like no as in KNOW justice, and you'll also KNOW peace, but also no as in NO justice, NO PE or peace as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
hadn't even thought of that. That's wonderful. Thank you. Yes. So somehow we weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. Do you feel that that's still under the umbrella of shade, or do you feel as though that last line begins to kind of step out of the darkness? So I feel like this is a big piece here, right? Let me just, I need to make sure I can share it just so that everybody can see it, right? So somehow we weathered. So she started off by saying, and yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. And here we can see this in the beginning, I talk about alliteration, which she uses a lot of, right? So somehow we weathered and witnessed, right? Just noticing how that comes into play in terms of how she establishes a rhythm in the poem with the use of alliteration. All right, I'm going to move on to the next piece. So we, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny Black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother, can dream of becoming president only to find herself residing for one. And yes, we were far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. What comes up for folks in this piece? Why are we not striving for a perfect union? Let's start there.
Well, I like the part about how we're not trying to strive for a union that is perfect or a country that is perfect, because, that the more perfect union, is it's part of the Declaration of Independence, right? And just the idea that that perfection is not something that's achievable, but purpose is. So I kind of liked that.
Yeah.
I don't like this ideal of perfect.
Right.
Because I don't know, it's just not achievable, and it's often tainted with what the dominant people feel is perfect.
Right. And perfection suggests there is nothing to change.
Right.
Right.
Nothing more to grow and learn. And yeah.
Right. And so I think, you know, when she says, why are we not striving? You know, when she says the whole deal about a union that is perfect, I think we're not striving for it, because if we are, then we're saying that what we have is good as is, right? And it's not, because I think in the poem, she's really trying to share this idea of the union sort of ever evolving, right? And it, you know, again, I come back to this situation of COVID. It really has shown us that change is constant, right? And that perfection is fleeting. So there is none of that. But when we're purposeful, then there's more intent, right? What do others think?
I thought this was one part of many that just gave me goosebumps when I was listening to her recite it. And especially the lines where she's saying, where a skinny Black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one.
That's powerful.
What a wordsmith, right? I mean, there's so much history and present time and hope for the future all in those lines. And it was just so she starts to climb out of the dark, so to speak, right? And bring some hope.
Yeah, and she also is very seriously, her intent is seriously to run for president as soon as she becomes of age. So I think that's something to note. You know, she's very serious about this idea of running for president. So I think that also allows her to insert herself as where potential lies in this ever evolving union that we have, right? Anything else from this?
I think this part.
That's fantastic that she's going to run for president. How cool is that? That's amazing.
Yeah, she's very serious about that. Yes, Jessica.
So a few things. I love that she's inserting herself in the way she's saying, we the people, or we the collective, but hey, I am a part of that we, and you are going to respect me, and I'm going to be in dialogue here.
Right.
So that, I love that stance. And then this conversation about perfect. So I've been grappling with what it means to be white, shocking, and perfect, you know, is this idea. I think a lot of that where perfection comes from in our country and who gets to decide what's perfect. And to me, that has roots in slave ownership, right? Like there's just, or your boss, or, you know, or your parent, you never get to decide what's perfect. Like there's always this standard out there, right?
Yeah.
So I love that she's saying that's not what we're going for here. She's rejecting that notion. And as I listen for more and more. I'm listening for ableist language, and here she's rejecting the ableism straight out.
Yeah.
We're saying we don't care. That's not the conversation.
Right.
And I love that.
Yeah, we're not going for perfect, we're going for purpose. End of the story. Yes, I do like that too. Awesome. All right, let's jump to the next. And so we lift our gaze not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we forever be tied together victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Perfect. Or not. Right? So I feel like here, you know, this idea of lifting your gaze, when I read that, I felt as though if we started from the beginning of the poem, we're looking down, right? And so she is encouraging this idea of looking up. So either looking up towards the future or at least lifting your gaze to see what is in front of you. A lot of what we're hearing in DEI spaces is this idea of white people saying, I didn't know, how could I have missed, right? This idea of burying your head in the sand and not knowing all the atrocities that have been happening before you, and now it's happening in conversations, right? So this idea of removing the veil, so to speak, and lifting up to really look and face what is before us. I think is really important in this piece. And she talks about, you know, not necessarily to see what stands between us, right? But what stands before us? What are we seeing in front of us? And I think what we're seeing in front of us, if there's a mirror, it's yourself. And how are you interplaying with you showing up in present day society, and what are you doing about it? Because collectively we can create change, but really that change starts with us intimately, right? So how do you see yourself as being a proponent for change in order to get to the top? Any other thoughts? I love the idea of arms. I think that is so great, where she says, we lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to each other. This seems to me a direct call on the Capitol Hill insurrection, right? Where they picked up their arms, so to speak, under this guise of, you know, fighting for the Republic, right? And she is saying, you know, we have to come together.
Or, sorry to interrupt, I was just
That's
thinking,
okay.
lay down our arms, because you know when you hold a weapon, you're raising up
You're
your
holding up,
arms.
yes.
Yeah, so that could like point it out as saying like laying down the arms we hold our weapons so that we could reach out our arms to see.
Yep. That's a good one, absolutely, right? So there's so much richness in this particular one, because, you know, like you said, it's laying down your arms, so putting down your weapons. It could also mean putting down literally the arms that you've taken up, right? And this idea of reaching across the gap, so to speak, outstretched in, you know, the we collective. I think here she's really trying to embody this we collective.
Yeah, and I think that also like resonates with let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. It's like it's not just like for American to hear, but for the earth to hear that what she's saying about American is true.
Right, right. And she's not, I don't think she's trying to you know, sugarcoat stuff, right? Because she says that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hope. So even through all the turmoil, there's still this light at the end of the tunnel that we're always moving towards, right? That we'll forever be tied together victorious. And so she is going in for the win here in terms of what she's hoping we can aspire to collectively.
Can I just say another thing? I think
Yeah.
the victorious here, it's not meant for one side or one, you know, one how to say
Team A, team B.
Yeah, one team, but it's like victory for all. So that's really profound. So that nobody would lose this game.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you. All right. Go ahead. Go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like, and I haven't read through this all again yet, but the sense that she's sort of rewriting our Constitution and the references like we, the, or we, kind of similar to, which is often referred to in the Constitution, and then the various amendments. So she talked about in the first part where quiet doesn't necessarily mean peace, and the First Amendment referencing our right to speech, freedom of speech.
Right.
And the Second Amendment being around the right to bear arms. And here we're talking about, putting down our arms or our weapons.
So it's almost parallel. It's almost running in parallel to the Constitution. And how can we reshape or rewrite or perceive it differently so that we can all be victorious, right? Yeah, absolutely. All right.
That's very cool. I had not thought about that. That she's intentionally paralleling the Constitution. That's awesome. Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We'll see if it holds up.
Well, I think it's good because it's always good that we can discuss interpretation, because that's where you find the true meat maybe as to how things end up being perceived differently. So here she says, Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promise to glade the hill we climb if only we dare. It's because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us.
Isn't that a line from Hamilton, the song?
Could be.
History has its eye on us.
I haven't seen Hamilton yet. All right, so how does this resonate for folks? This idea of Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. So
does anybody know that scriptural reference? I'm trying to think. Is it from Yeah, what is it?
I think it's from 1 King. I think I wrote it down. 1 King, I think it's chapter 24, where they talk about this vine and fig tree as representative of health and prosperity, and that everyone is entitled to that, right? And so is that what is happening currently? One would argue no, right? And so she says, Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. So this idea of everyone having a piece of the pie, which is the intention, but it's not what actually happens. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. I think this is a direct response to this divide, right, that is constantly happening, and that what is considered victorious is not in us constantly battling, but instead building bridges to come together. Yes, Andrea. Oh.
I didn't have anything to say, but I did find the scripture. It was Micah 4:4. Micah, the 4th chapter, or at least where I found it. It may be referenced someplace else.
Yeah, I think it
probably multiple places.
I think, yeah, 1 Kings 4:25, denoting that health and prosperity belongs to everyone, not just a select few. And so we shouldn't be afraid to attain that, because the fig tree symbolizes the health of a nation, both physically and spiritually. And so leaning into that as part of how we achieve wholeness, I think, is really good here. And she comes back again to talk about the hill we climb, right? So that is the promise to Glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare. She also makes reference here, and I think this is where she talks about the insurrection. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. So I think this was a direct reference to what was happening.
And it also seems like a reference to the suppression of the vote in certain areas, you know.
For democracy, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, this piece on democracy. You know, I like this where she says it's because being American is more than a pride we inherit, right? And this idea that being American is typically seen as something to be hailed, but we have to repair what has happened in the past before we can first really embody how we show up in the present and in the future. And I think that's really important in, again, her messaging of how are we going to get to the light, right? How are we going to get to the light? How are we going to get out from the shade and get to the light? All right, moving along to the next verse. This is the era of just redemption. We feared at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it, we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So, while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be. A country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold. We fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation, because become the future, sorry. Our blunders become their burdens. I need to move this just out of the way. Is that a little much for folks? So again, I think here she's talking about the insurrection. We feared at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour. But within it, we found the power to author a new chapter. So it feels as though at first she is talking about the despair of what had happened, but because of this thing that had happened, we're beginning to climb out. So while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? So this idea, I think, that maybe we were existing and these folks existed while we governed, and was sort of, I feel, probably undercover, right? Simmering at the bottom. And then suddenly that catastrophe sort of was above us, right? It's my interpretation, this idea of the insurrection being represented as catastrophe, and probably we not knowing that it was there or not paying attention. Again, this idea of lifting the veil. And then suddenly catastrophe was above us. And so we had to sort of fight to get out of that, right? And she's like, we will not march back to what was, which is kind of where the insurrection lied, right? In things that had gone on years before. This idea of, you know, wanting to take the democracy because you didn't like what it stood for, what was happening, right? This idea of this is what we voted for, and there being no respect for that, and not wanting to take that and value that as true. Any other thoughts?
That last line seems to reflect on that so personally about the inertia, because like, and I think she said like, we know what the inertia like leads to, or something like that.
Yeah, the non-doing, right?
It just seems so personal.
Yeah.
We know what it will lead to because we ourselves have experienced the inertia where we thought nothing can happen, and things happened and built up because of inaction.
Right. So she says we will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation, right? So clearly she's like, we can't sit still and do nothing at a time like this, because then those who come after us will inherit the very same burden or worse, right? And if we're trying to move forward, then the idea is not to sit and do nothing, but quite the opposite.
She phrases it so beautifully, especially with that alliteration that's going there. It's very powerful.
Yeah, because she ends it by saying our blunders become our burdens, become their burdens, sorry. So when we don't do anything, whatever burden that we left there is really going to be on them, right? The next generation. So how can we clear that path?
To me, this section also reminded me of our history of civil rights and marching for freedom. And it also reminds me of a song that was used during the movement where they talk about ain't gonna let nobody turn us around, that we'll keep marching on for freedom. And so that part kind of in between where she says we will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, combined with a we will not be turned around, kind of reminded me of that song.
Yeah, I don't know that song. I'm gonna have to look up into it. Thank you. All right, moving right along.
There's another song that this poem reminded me of a couple of stanzas back. It goes, I'm going to lay down my sword and shield down the riverside. That I won't fight no more. Is kind of like, it's a very impassioned kind of moving song, and it's not about doing nothing, but it's laying down your arms.
So maybe being an activist in a different way.
Yeah, like a peaceful, you know, protest. Yeah.
Right. Again, alluding to like civil rights, right?
Right. And I believe in that song, there's a line about vine and fig tree. And I feel like it's this promise of moving everyone forward. Right. I don't know. There's just something very cool there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah.
But one thing is certain, if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. Every breath from my bronze pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the golden hills of the West. We will rise from the windswept Northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. think, powerful stance in terms of calling upon the entire United States, reaching across the landscape and really pulling in everyone to say, you know, this is what we need to do in order to come together. This is what we need to do in order to succeed. Understanding that we want to change the narrative. What are we hoping will be the legacy or our children's birthright after this era, right? What are we hoping to leave them? And so she's saying, let us leave a country that is better than the one we were given, which is really important. And this idea of just coming together again. So I think that particular section is really self-explanatory, right? It's kind of easy to dice up.
This section also reminded me of another song. I think a lot in music. And it's like, this land is your land, this land is my land. They have references to different parts of the country. And you had opened us up with a reference to Maya Angelou as well. And her poetry, which often states, like, commands us to rise.
Right, right. And this idea of rising denotes that, you know, in order for you to rise, it means you've been lying down, so to speak, right? You have been doing nothing. And so rising up in order to get something done, right? Rising up in action. I think we should have had Amanda. We could have invited her. All right, I'm gonna move on to the next one. All right, so here we are. And every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn balloons as we free it, for there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. That has to be the best part of the poem for me. I think she really succinctly wrapped everything up and really calls us out of the dark, right? This idea, again, this theme of light and dark, and how do we want to be reflected moving forward? How do we use ourselves as beacons of light in a dark place to sort of lead others to follow, and understanding just how much individually we have a lot of potential, right? But then again, as we come collectively, that light can definitely sort of minimize or obscure the darkness, so to speak, right? Any other thoughts?
I love the call to action.
Yeah.
She's calling us to see it, and then to find your bravery and be it.
Yeah. And this idea of being battered and beautiful, I love that, right? Two extreme versions of who you can be, but still rising up that way to get this work done.
I love that it called out, this land is your land, this land is my land, because I think when that song was written, it was a kind of a radical socialist kind of call, saying, you know, that everybody owns this land. It's not just the capitalist, you know, millionaires and the landowners. This is our land collectively. And I also, when I was watching the inauguration, I was texting several different friends, like from across the country. And when the references to Maya Angelou's Rise poem were just, everybody got that instantly. It was just like, you know, knowing that she was hearkening to Maya Angelou was really powerful, I thought.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, was Maya Angelou not the only other Black woman to have read a poem at an inauguration. I think, I could be wrong, but I'm almost sure she was the only other Black woman to have read at an inauguration. And so there's a lot of, again, parallel in where Amanda might have pulled her, what do we want to say?
Well, it was almost, to me, it was almost like a passing of the baton to the next generation of, you know, a young female Black poet, you know, it was sort of like, that was, and it was, that's so hopeful to know that we have you know, a whole new generation of powerful, artistic, young people that will hopefully help us dig out of this disaster.
Yeah. So I think, you know, it was really good the way she started and gave us, I think she tried to, one of her quotes, which I will read here, she said, "There's space for grief and horror and hope and unity." And I also hope that there is a breath of joy in the poem, because I do think we have a lot to celebrate at this inauguration. So understanding how many pieces that she wanted to pull into the space, even though this dark cloud was sort of hanging over the space, how do you pull yourself out of that and still celebrate the wins, right? And seeing the inauguration as a win, understanding that the cloud is representative of all the things that America has done in the past that we're just trying to become, we're trying to reckon with right now, even as much as you know, the insurrection, and sort of illustrating that we are the light, I think, which is most important, and understanding how collectively we can rise up to be a better social order, so to speak. Awesome. Well, I think we've tied up nicely Amanda Gorman's poem. I hope folks enjoyed, you know, workshopping the piece and really weaving through all the pieces and understanding how much she pulled from what is happening currently and what has happened in the past to bring this piece to fruition, and just sort of understanding how we perceive things, right? And how many good points that we got in talking to each other about breaking down the poem. I thank you all for attending.
Lisa, on behalf of the People's Heart, I want to thank you for facilitating this really rich workshop and for leading us through this poem. And for formality, I should also say, just for the recording, that the views expressed in this workshop don't necessarily represent the views of the institution, but we're all independent thinkers, and we can all converse and need to converse about these topics, and it's so wonderful to do that through the arts. So thank you so much for leading us through this discussion, and I really hope that we get to do this again, and that someday Amanda Gorman will be here with us too.
I know. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for attending.
Thank you, Lisa. That was great. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.